Hello, I'm Alison Hargreaves from guidesforbrides.co.uk. I'm very pleased to be sharing the results of the venue and couples survey looking at postponement and cancellation policies. So what's really important is just to clarify, this isn't about looking at contractual law. This is understanding a little bit more about what other venues are doing so that you can perhaps benchmark yourselves against what others are considering to be the right approach at the moment, and also to understand what the expectations of couples are, because that's incredibly important from the point of view of a long-term reputation, to be trying to do what they are seeing as being reasonable and are perhaps discussing in various forums and online. So let's have a look at the data. So this was the survey sent out last week, and one of the things that became very, very clear quite quickly was that the large venues and individual venues had quite similar patterns. What we were noticing is there was an anomaly with the small venue groups, so that's defined as between 2 and 15 venues. They're very often investor backed. They tend to be incredibly popular with couples. A lot of them really are designed very much just for weddings. So they've got a completely different set of challenges and limitations. And it will become obvious as we look through some of the survey results, the implications of that. And we need to be quite careful that the independent and often privately owned venues that make British weddings quite so unique and have their own unique challenges aren't compromised if these investor-backed venue groups need to take perhaps a slightly firmer line than others in order to protect their revenue. So the data set was looking at approximately 541 venues. And you'll notice straight away, we can see why it's so important to be able to study the data of the different venue makeup separately. So you can see on here, the blue line is more flexible terms, and the yellow line is using common sense, as the contract wasn't designed for a pandemic. So large venue groups were largely just being more flexible with their couples and accepting that that contract was not there for this situation. Small venue groups were the only ones that were enforcing the terms of their contracts. So you can see why the contractual issues have become quite an important area for these venues to be discussing. Not surprisingly, a lot of the individual venues were needing that little bit of help, not knowing whether contracts were enforceable. And we're also looking at different, quite creative solutions to look at how they dealt with their policies. So again, looking at what the postponement policy was primarily based on. So this is the big balance that everyone's been dealing with of reputation versus revenue. And again, it's those small venue groups, presumably because they're quite often investor backed, were needing to look after their own business needs. Whereas individual venues, more than half, put the needs of their couples above even protecting their business, let alone trying to ensure that their business was going to be financially not impacted quite so much. What's interesting, looking at that same data, at the same time, we surveyed couples and had results from about 748 respondents. And what's quite interesting is the difference in perception, whereas it's a very, very small overall percentage of venues felt that their policy was primarily there to look after their own business needs. Almost 20% of couples felt that that was the venue's main priority. They weren't looking after them as couples, they were looking after themselves. So on to the bigger questions. Cancellations has been a really challenging question. Most want to avoid cancellation. Most venues and couples are preferring to postpone. But there are situations that we've looked at here where cancellation is slightly inevitable or needs to be there as a choice. So couples getting married under the current restrictions, couples with weddings planned later this year and then just wanting to completely give up on these plans. They're wanting that deposit back. They're wanting to take control again. Venues wanting to give couples reasonable notice. So very often these are venues that have made the financial decision it doesn't make sense to take staff off furlough. They're not wanting to run those weddings later on this year if it's only one or two couples wanting to go ahead. Then we have the awful situation that we were facing on Friday, so couples needing to cancel at the very last minute, or venues, as it was on Friday, needing to cancel at the very last minute. And this is, you can see with the couples, it really is right the way across the board. It's a complete split, from some venues feeling that 0% is appropriate, right up to others feeling 100% retention is going to be needed. Obviously, where it is venues, it's much clearly in the couple's favour if the venue cancels. But you can really see from this data why couples are so worried about going ahead. They know there's a huge risk of cancellation this year, as Friday demonstrated, and they're not wanting to be in this position where the venue is cancelling and potentially, this was 7% of venues thinking they'd be keeping 100% in that situation after we've been encouraging them to hold on to their plans and go ahead. So when we look at the couple's perspective on this, it is very similar. The main difference you'll notice is the couple's perception that if they are cancelling, they really don't feel that they should be charged these sort of 75 to 100% penalties. So that is quite a big anomaly on that one. So if we're looking at postponements, the vast majority, this green line, is being able to postpone from any date in 2020. So this includes those that are still in the system at the moment, any date in 2020 through to next year. We also looked, which was much less clear on here, on the price increase for those wanting to postpone right the way through to 2022. So on that, it worked out that with 86% of venues, or 94% of couples, would support a cap of up to 15%, much less support for any higher amounts. Postponing to any available date, not surprisingly, a lot of venues have to restrict their Saturdays. I think everyone understood you need to be able to protect the means of having an income next year. 75% would give a free postponement to any date next year. It averaged as 90% of venues would offer free postponement with minor restrictions, such as to off-peak dates, low season dates before 31st of March, and so on. Again, we've got real similarity between venues and couples on how much was the maximum they felt they should be charged. And at a 15% cap, 91% of venues and 87.8% of brides would be happy with that sort of level of cap. So we are hearing occasionally of couples being told they're going to be charged 30, 40, 50, 60% to postpone. Those venues are obviously really in the minority. So thank goodness couples are, it seems, being allowed to postpone. And this is exactly the same question being asked of brides. No surprise, much higher number expecting it to be free, or 10%. and none expecting any significant charges on that. For those that are being postponed, the next question is very much on how the prepayments should be handled. And a lot of couples have used this as a point of negotiation with their venue. So they have offered to pay the final payments now if they can postpone to next year. And the couples have really appreciated that option. We've had a lot of feedback on this. They feel they're helping the venue. They're doing what they can. They'd already pledged that money. They were expecting to spend it this year. It was there and ready. And I think it shows real trust in the venues, that they know the venue is going to be there for them next year, and they want to be, part of that machine that helps keep them going. So that's really good. And I think that is something that, although inevitably it's the difficult situations that we tend to be dealing with, and the issues where things are going wrong, one of the things that's really, really unique in the wedding sector is we have massive support from couples. Couples are really getting behind venues and suppliers and really wanting to shout out and let people know when their venue or suppliers have looked after them well. And I think that's echoed here with these couples volunteering the extra payments now. Although 78% of venues were saying that they would move payments that weren't yet due to the new date, there was quite a different perception here from couples. Only 45% of couples were saying all their payments had moved. And in fact, 20% of couples had already paid in full for their wedding this year. So they're being given they're in a slightly more precarious situation. So where are we? The current situation with the 30 person receptions that were on the cards for starting on Saturday the 1st. It's now going to be not before the 15th. And although there were some venues that were calling for these small receptions, it's not generally been considered great news for many venues. We know a lot of couples have been pushed to pubs and restaurants where they can get a really cost-effective 30-person reception. It cuts out suppliers. It's also pushing couples underground. We know of a lot of marquee companies that are taking on a lot of extra bookings at the moment. I think the feeling is that the chances are nobody's going to take a photograph with more than 30 guests in, so they'll probably feel they can get away with it. It's not great news for the venue industry, and probably not that helpful. There's an exact same split from the point of view of venues and couples. Both 65% said they would prefer to postpone if the restriction is 30 people. Of those going ahead, the anomaly there is slightly higher number from couples, but quite a few of them had said they would go ahead, but not with their original venue, which is a little bit of a worry. The bigger issue with the 30 limit is actually the financial implications. So this was the survey that we did very early on in lockdown, when we were looking at various figures that we felt would be helpful for the government in starting to look at policies for when we could reopen. And we established from that survey that with 50 guests or less, so this isn't even just with that smaller number of 30, with 50 guests, only 28% of venues could run at a profit. And in fact, if you watch this pale blue line going up, this is the point at which venues could run at a profit. And it's 70% before the majority of venues could be running at a profit. So social distancing in most places within the restaurant guidelines would allow for capacity of around 70. So it's not been unreasonable for the entire industry to be getting behind this idea that instead of opening up for these very, very small receptions that are going to be so restricted and cut out almost all of the suppliers, is it perhaps It's not for me to say, but perhaps the answer here is it would be better to wait until we can be opening to those restaurant guidelines. It also means that all types of weddings for all cultures are more likely to be able to go ahead in these bigger venues as well. And it seems to give a little bit more parity right the way across the industry. For those that are needing to go ahead with these lower numbers, and I know a lot were worried about being forced to go ahead with these lower numbers, we've been really impressed at how few venues have in fact, or currently are saying, are asking the couples to pay the same. This is very, very different from a survey. Even a month ago, a lot more were saying they would expect the couples to pay the same. They would just want to upgrade the menus and so on. Again, there is a little bit of a difference between what venues are saying and the perception of couples. Quite a lot more couples feel that they're being charged the same amount. A reasonable number are still looking at splitting the wedding events, but issues with insurance is causing problems with this. So we were really keen that couples considered this as an option, because it gave venues the opportunity to charge something at this stage for a small wedding to go ahead, and really hooks the couple in for coming back in a year or however long it's going to take in order to have their bigger evening reception. But all of the main insurers seem to be making it quite clear that they're not going to insure those sort of split events. The couples would have to choose which one. And as Friday demonstrated, had they chosen the bigger, more costly evening reception, they would be really, really suffering now, as it would have meant any events on Saturday would not have been covered. No surprise that the majority, again, were wanting postponement. But this does then, all of these postponed weddings does put that added financial pressure on venues to need to reach next year. And the bigger picture on postponements, and one of the many reasons that the CMA are so interested in this sector, is the huge amounts of money in an industry where inevitably some won't get to the other side, and they've got consumer money in their accounts. The long-term impact on consumer confidence really is huge if we do have businesses going under with these big deposits. But I think the CMA will be very reassured that so many are already using a client account. Not surprisingly, a lot of large venue groups, but we were really surprised at how many individual venues were. Understandably, the privately owned were perhaps again needing to look after their cash flow. Quite a few were commenting that they needed to use the deposits and prepayments for maintaining the venue and grounds, and therefore couldn't put in a client account. And it takes us slightly full circle back to these very different opinions on cancellations. We know it's been a bit of an ongoing question mark and perhaps a dispute between some of these venues and the CMA's policy on whether maintenance can be deducted in case of a cancellation, whether that is considered a reasonable cost. And you can see why if these prepayments and deposits are being used as working capital. And not surprisingly, individual venues are perfectly happy with the idea of client accounts, but would want cash flow to improve before they can get to that point. So in order to make sure we've got that consumer confidence, one of the things that we've been looking at is offering a free cancellation and postponement policy. And we launched a Book with Confidence campaign quite early on in lockdown, so that those venues and suppliers who were in a position to be able to hold those deposits in a client account, to encourage bookings now while there is so much uncertainty and while couples can't get insurance, from those couples that are wanting to confirm dates and wanting to be able to move forward with their plans. And we've been really surprised at the number that would want to take that up. So 85% would be able to do it for deposit and or prepayments. Again, individual venues, huge number doing it for prepayments as well as the deposit. Again, quite a surprise. We'd expected this. At the moment, our policy does only cover the deposit, but it seems that might be something that could be really helpful for individual venues and really help them stand out from the crowd to have that extra flexibility. Sadly, it's not something that most of the small venue groups, or a large number of the small venue groups, only 55% felt that that's something that they could offer. It just, I'm guessing if they are restricted by those contract clauses, they can't make those exceptions even in these extreme times, which is difficult. Clearly, we are needing the government support to get us to the other side on this. And one of the final questions we asked in the survey is what sort of support was likely to be helpful. And it's no surprise that furlough extension through to March 2021 was a clear winner here. What we know is that suppliers are wanting the absolute opposite from venues. And in finding solutions for the wedding sector, it's either going to need different solutions for different sectors, or if the Chancellor can find something that might help everyone, my goodness, that would be amazing. But the SEIS scheme was very much something that the smaller, very often the suppliers find that's the most helpful one. And interest-free loans, nobody is wanting to take on more loans at the moment. Particularly these smaller businesses, it just doesn't make financial sense to them. But interest-free loans that will perhaps get them to the other side would be helpful. And there's very good reason for us to need this support. So the data we had, this was before Friday's news, and only 4% felt it was very unlikely that they would have to cancel their wedding in 2020. So the vast majority of couples thinking it's either very likely or likely that their 2020 wedding will be cancelled. It's perhaps not the greatest prospect, but I think it is just making clear what all of us were suspecting. And I think on Friday, that was a really, really hard blow to the entire wedding industry. But I think a fairly clear message that this is not going to be a short-term issue. Perhaps weddings for 30 might open up on the 15th. I have my own personal reservations as to whether that's going to happen. I think the fact that government guidance didn't come out before the 1st suggests that they're already seeing that you just can't make it COVID secure. It's a social gathering, and that's going to be really, really difficult. And if they really have, as they said on Friday, reached the limits of what they can do to open the country up, then it's quite hard to see them being able to allow weddings for the time being. I really hope that data has been helpful. As ever, we're here to support you. I know it's going to be a long, hard winter. It's going to be 3 winters in a row for all of those amazing wedding venues out there. We're here, we're behind you, we're going to be here for you. So anything at all we can do to help, please don't hesitate to shout. If it's any flicker of hope for you, there really are a lot of couples already starting to plan for 2021, 2022. They're not giving up on things. These new couples are coming in. They've not been put off. Weddings will be back. It's just going to take a little bit of time and hopefully some support from the government to get us all there to the other side. Thank you very much indeed.